Welcome to Duskferry. This is a place for slow stories, told quietly, for the part of the night when your mind is still busy and your body just wants to rest. You don't need to do anything to listen. Turn the lights down or off completely. Put on your headphones if that helps you settle, or just let the voice fill the room. Get comfortable in whatever way your body already knows how, on your side, on your back, wrapped in whatever you sleep under. There is nowhere else you need to be right now. I want to say one thing before we begin, because it matters more than anything else in this story. If you fall asleep before it ends, that is not a failure. That is the entire point. This voice will still be here, speaking softly into a room where you're no longer listening, and that is exactly as it should be. You don't need to finish. You only need to rest. Tonight's crossing takes us to a low, marshy island off the coast of what is now North Carolina in the final years of the 1500s. A small English settlement was left there with a promise that someone would return for them. When someone finally did, every person was gone, and the only clue they left behind was a single word carved into a post with no sign of struggle, no grave, no fire, no blood. For more than 400 years, no one has been fully certain what became of them. Let the ferry carry you across the water, into the dark, and into their story. A kingdom. Across the water. In the spring of 1584, a young courtier in London held a piece of paper that gave him something almost no Englishman had ever legally possessed. It was a royal patent, signed by Queen Elizabeth I, and it granted him the right to explore, settle, and govern any land in the New World, not already claimed by a Christian prince. His name was Walter Raleigh. He was not yet the man history would remember, not yet a knight, not yet the swaggering courtier of legend, not yet the prisoner who would spend 13 years in the Tower of London, writing a history of the world he never finished. In 1584, he was simply ambitious, deeply in the Queen's favor, and in possession of a document that let him claim, on paper, an entire coastline he had never seen. England, at that moment, was late to a race it very much wanted to win. Spain had been pulling gold and silver out of the Americas for the better part of a century. Portugal had its trade routes to the east. France had already tried and failed to plant a colony in Florida, and most of the French colonists there had been massacred by the Spanish for the crime of being Protestant on land. Spain considered its own. England had tried too, in small, quiet, mostly forgotten ways. Fishing fleets off Newfoundland, a failed settlement attempt in Newfoundland itself. But it had never held a permanent foothold anywhere in North America. Raleigh's patent was meant to change that. It was also, quietly, meant to give England a base from which privateers could raid Spanish treasure ships as they sailed home from the Caribbean, heavy with silver. The colony that would eventually rise and vanish on a low, marshy island called Roanoke was never simply about settlement. From its very first sentence on paper, it was also about war with Spain, fought without ever officially declaring it. Raleigh himself never set foot in America, not once in his entire life. He sent others in his place, funded by his own fortune and by investors he persuaded to share the risk. And the first of these voyages left England in April of 1584 under two captains, Philip Amadas, barely past 20 years old, and Arthur Barlow, a more seasoned sailor who would later write the account that made this new land sound, to English ears back home, almost like paradise. They crossed the Atlantic on the southern route, catching favorable trade winds down past the Canary Islands, and then the Caribbean, before turning north along the coast of what is now North Carolina. In July, They reached a chain of long, low barrier islands, the Outer Banks, protecting a wide, shallow sound behind them from the open Atlantic. They found an inlet, sailed through it, and anchored in water so calm and so different from the ocean they had just crossed that Barlow would later describe the moment with something close to wonder. The land, he wrote, smelled so sweetly, and was so full of a good, strong scent that they believed themselves to be standing near some delicate garden, not a wild, uncharted shore, an ocean away from anything familiar. For 2 days, they saw no one. Then, on the 3rd day, a small boat approached, carrying 3 men. One of them came ashore alone and stood on the beach for a long while, saying nothing, simply waiting, as if testing whether the newcomers meant him harm. When Amadas and a small party of Englishmen finally walked toward him with gifts, he showed no fear at all. He accepted what they offered, made gestures of goodwill, and then, alone, in a small boat, began fishing in the shallow water near their ships. In less than half an hour, Barlow wrote, he had filled his boat as full as it could hold. He divided the catch into 2 piles on the shore, one for each of the English ships, gestured toward them, and left. The man's name, they would later learn, was Granganimeo. He was the brother of Wingina, who ruled as chief, or werowance, over a network of Algonquian-speaking towns along this stretch of coast, a paramount chief in the way that European visitors understood the term, though the real relationships between towns and leaders here were almost certainly more fluid and more negotiated than the English, looking for kings and courts wherever they went, ever fully understood. What followed, in Barlow's telling, was several weeks of remarkably warm contact. Granganimeo returned with his wife and children. Trade began. The English offering tin dishes, which the Algonquian visitors reportedly hung around their necks as ornaments, and copper, which seems to have been valued even more highly than gold, since it was rarer here and associated with certain kinds of spiritual and social power. The English, in turn, wanted furs and dressed deerskins, and above all, information about the land, about the rivers that ran inland, about which towns were friendly, which were not, and what the interior of this vast continent might contain. Barlow's account describes the local people as gentle, loving, and living after the manner of the Golden Age. A phrase lifted straight from classical poetry, describing not the Algonquian world as it actually was, but the fantasy of an untouched paradise that English readers back home were primed to want to hear. It is worth pausing on that, because it matters for everything that comes after. Barlow was not simply reporting what he saw, he was writing a sales pitch, meant to persuade Queen Elizabeth and a roomful of wealthy investors to fund a much larger expedition. The land he described was, in real and important ways, a land that existed mostly on paper, warmer, emptier, gentler, and more welcoming than the reality anyone would actually find once real settlers, hungry and desperate, arrived to stay. Before the 2 ships turned back for England in late summer, something else happened that would shape everything to follow. 2 Algonquian men agreed to sail back across the Atlantic with the English. Their names were Manteo and Wanchese. Manteo came from Croatoan, an island community to the south, tied by kinship to the Roanoke people, but politically distinct from them, a detail that would matter enormously years later, in ways no one in 1584 could have predicted. Wanchese came from Roanoke itself, from Wingina's own people. Why either man agreed to leave his home, his language, his entire world, and cross an ocean toward a country he had never seen, we don't fully know. It may have been curiosity. It may have been a calculated act of diplomacy, a way for local leaders to gather their own intelligence on these strange new visitors by sending trusted men to observe them on their own ground, the same way the English wanted eyewitnesses to describe the new world back home. Both explanations are almost certainly true at once, in different measure, for different reasons, for each man. Thomas Harriot's work with Manteo and Wanchese in London went well beyond simple vocabulary lists, because English spelling had no reliable way to represent many of the sounds in their language. Harriot invented an entirely new phonetic alphabet, specifically for the purpose, drawing on his mathematical training to design symbols that could capture consonants and vowels English letters simply weren't built to hold. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the more remarkable intellectual achievements to come out of this entire colonial venture. A young Englishman, working patiently with two men who had crossed an ocean into a completely unfamiliar world, building a written system from scratch so that a language with no prior alphabet of its own could finally be recorded with some real precision. Most of Harriot's original manuscript on the subject was later lost, known today mostly through references in his other surviving work, which makes it one of this story's quieter tragedies. A serious, respectful piece of linguistic scholarship, produced at the very start of sustained contact between these two peoples, that might have preserved far more of the Carolina Algonquian language than ultimately survived. In recent decades, linguists and members of descendant communities working to document and revive Algonquian languages along the Atlantic coast have returned to what fragments of Harriot's system do survive, piecing together clues from his other writings and from later colonial records, in a slow, careful effort to recover pieces of a language that very nearly vanished entirely along with the world it belonged to. In England, Manteo and Wanchese became, for a season, minor celebrities. They were presented at court. Scholars studied their language, trying to build the first real vocabulary lists of an Algonquian tongue that English ears had ever systematically recorded. One of those scholars, a brilliant young mathematician and astronomer named Thomas Harriot, spent long hours with them, and the alphabet and phonetic system he developed to write down their speech, sounds that English spelling had no letters for, would later travel back across the ocean with him, tucked into the same expedition that carried the fate of an entire colony. The two men reacted very differently to what they saw. Manteo, by every surviving account, grew close to the English, learned their language quickly, and would go on to serve, again and again, as an interpreter, guide, and diplomat between the two worlds for the rest of the colony's short existence. Wanchese's experience seems to have gone the other way. Whatever he witnessed in London, a city of tens of thousands of people crowded into narrow streets, a level of wealth and poverty and raw human density that nothing in his home world had prepared him for. He returned to Roanoke deeply suspicious of English intentions, and he would spend the following years working, quietly, and then not so quietly, against them. Barlow's report, and the presence of these two men speaking of a green, fertile, welcoming land across the sea, achieved exactly what Raleigh needed. The Queen was pleased enough to grant him a knighthood, and she gave the new territory a name, chosen in her own honor, for the Queen who had never married, and who was known, in the flattering language of her court, as the Virgin Queen. They called it Virginia. Within a year, a much larger expedition would cross the same ocean. Not merchants and explorers this time, but soldiers, sent to build something permanent on that same low island behind the barrier banks. Manteo would sail home with them, back toward Roanoke, back toward the world he had left. Wanchese would sail home too, carrying with him a very different report than the one Barlow had written for the Queen, and carrying it not to a court in London, but to his own chief Wingina, who would have to decide what to do with several hundred armed Englishmen who intended to stay. The soldiers who came first. The second expedition left England in April of 1585, and it looked nothing like the first. Barlow and Amadas had sailed with 2 ships and a spirit of careful, curious diplomacy. This new fleet carried 7 ships, roughly 600 men, and a fair amount of artillery, because this time the goal was not to look and report back. It was to build something permanent and to hold it, by force if necessary, against Spain, against starvation, and if it came to it, against the people who already lived there. The fleet sailed under Sir Richard Grenville, Raleigh's cousin, a man with a reputation for pride, temper, and a kind of theatrical courage that made him a good commander in a fight and a difficult man to be stranded with on an unfamiliar coast. Grenville's role, though, was never meant to be permanent. He was there to deliver the colonists, secure the settlement, and sail home, leaving behind a governor to run the colony day to day. That governor was Ralph Lane, a career soldier who had served in Ireland during some of the most brutal campaigns of England's long, grinding war to subdue that country. A background worth remembering, because Lane would bring the same instincts, the same readiness to answer any perceived threat with overwhelming force, to his dealings with the Algonquian towns of Roanoke. The crossing itself nearly ended the entire enterprise before it began. Grenville's flagship, the Tiger, struck a shoal while trying to navigate the treacherous inlet through the Outer Banks, and much of the fleet's food supply, grain, meant to feed the colonists through their first year, was ruined by seawater. It was an early, almost prophetic warning of just how unforgiving this coastline could be to ships that didn't know its shallow, shifting sandbars, and it meant that from nearly the first week, the colony's survival would depend more heavily than planned on trade and goodwill with the very towns whose relationship with the English was already, quietly, starting to fray. Roughly 100 to 108 men were left behind to form the actual colony, once Grenville and the bulk of the fleet sailed home. This was not a settlement of families. There were no women, no children, no farmers bringing seed corn to plant a future. It was almost entirely soldiers. A garrison, really, dressed in the language of colonization, but built in practice like a military outpost. They built a small fort on the north end of Roanoke Island, earthen walls enclosing a cluster of houses, and they settled in to wait out the year until the next supply fleet arrived. Daily life inside that earthen fort was harder and more monotonous than any of the promotional pamphlets back in London ever let on. The soldiers depended heavily on oysters and other shellfish gathered from the Sound at low tide, on fish caught in weirs built along the shallows, and on corn traded from nearby towns, since almost none of them had any experience growing crops of their own, and there had been no real time, in a single crowded first season, to clear and plant fields large enough to feed 100 men through a full winter. It was a garrison surviving month to month on the patience and surplus of its neighbors, which is a precarious way for any settlement to exist, and everyone involved, English and Algonquian alike, understood exactly how precarious it was, even if no one said so directly. Among these 100 men were 2 people whose names would end up mattering more to history than almost any soldiers. One was Thomas Harriot, the young mathematician who had spent the previous year learning the Algonquian language from Manteo and Wanchese in London, and who now had the chance to use it in the place it actually belonged. The other was John White, an artist, skilled enough to have painted for the Queen's own circle, brought along specifically to record what this new world looked like, its plants, its animals, its people, its towns, in careful, accurate watercolor, because Raleigh needed something more persuasive than Barlow's flattering prose to keep his investors interested. He needed pictures. What Harriet and White produced together over the following year remains one of the most valuable records of any Native American culture at the exact moment of first sustained contact with Europeans anywhere in North America. Harriet wrote a book, later published as A Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia, describing the region's resources, its people, their farming methods, their religious beliefs, their language, written with a scholar's careful curiosity rather than a soldier's contempt, though Harriet, too, was ultimately there to serve Raleigh's colonial ambitions, and his book was again partly a sales document meant to attract more investors and settlers. White's watercolors are, if anything, even more remarkable. He painted the town of Secautan with its neat fields of corn planted in careful rows, its ceremonial dances, its charnel houses where the bones of chiefs were kept. He painted a woman and child of Pomayuk. He painted men fishing by torchlight from canoes, spearing fish in the shallow sounds at night. These images survive today, and they are, in a very real sense, the only visual record we have of what this particular Algonquian world looked like before it was permanently changed by the people painting it. Harriet's written observations, meanwhile, captured something that would go on to reshape English habits back home in ways he could not possibly have predicted. He described, in careful, curious detail, a local custom of drying and smoking the leaves of a plant the Algonquian people called upawak, inhaled through a small pipe and used both socially and, they believed, medicinally. Harriet tried it himself, wrote approvingly of it, and is often credited as one of the people most responsible for introducing tobacco smoking into fashionable English society when he returned home. It is a strange thing to sit with in hindsight, that among everything this doomed, struggling colony produced, one of its most lasting global legacies was a habit picked up, almost incidentally, by a mathematician more interested in astronomy and cartography than in commerce, carried home in a leather pouch and passed quietly into a culture that would go on, centuries later, to build entire economies around it. Beyond tobacco, Harriet's Brief and True Report catalogued an enormous range of the region's plant and animal life, with the careful, systematic eye of a natural philosopher rather than a treasure hunter. He described maize, which the English had never grown or eaten before, along with beans, squash, and a variety of other crops cultivated by the Algonquian towns, using farming methods notably more sophisticated in several respects than what many of the English soldiers had known back home. Fields planted with companion crops that supported and fed one another, cleared and managed through controlled burning, yielding harvests that in good years comfortably fed far larger populations than the land might have seemed to support at first glance. He wrote about deer, bear, and the abundant fish and shellfish of the sounds, about the medicinal uses of certain barks and roots, and about sassafras, a fragrant root that would briefly become one of England's more valuable New World imports in its own right, prized in Europe at the time for its supposed medicinal properties. Lane's exploring parties, pushing up the Roanoke River and along the edges of the Chesapeake in search of gold that was never there, passed through dozens of small towns and villages along the way, each one another data point in the careful, curious record Harriet and White were quietly assembling, a record that would end up outlasting the colony itself by centuries, even after the men who made it were scattered, evacuated, or lost. But documentation was never the colony's actual purpose, and Lane, as governor, spent much of his year focused on something more urgent, finding a reason for this outpost to exist at all, beyond simply surviving. Raleigh and his investors back in London wanted results. Gold, or at least the promise of gold, a passage to the Pacific, anything that would justify the enormous cost of the expedition. Lane organized exploring parties up the region's rivers, pushing inland along the Roanoke River and the Chesapeake, searching for signs of precious metal, for a water route through the continent, for anything that might turn this fragile coastal outpost into a genuine source of wealth. He found none of it. What he found instead, again and again, was dependence on the corn, the fish, and the goodwill of the very towns his men were, at the same time, beginning to view with a soldier's wary suspicion. That dependence created a slow, grinding tension that Barlow's warm first encounter had never hinted at. A colony of 100 soldiers, with a badly damaged food supply and no women or families to farm long-term crops of their own, needed the Algonquian towns to keep feeding them through the winter, season after season, with no clear end date and no obvious benefit to the towns themselves for continuing to do so. Wingina, the chief whose brother Granganameo had so warmly welcomed Barlow's first small crew the year before, now found himself hosting an armed garrison that showed no sign of ever leaving, and that consumed food his own people would need to survive their own winter. Whatever warmth had existed in 1584 was, by the winter of 1585 into 86, wearing thin on both sides, worn down not by any single dramatic betrayal yet, but by the simple, grinding arithmetic of too many hungry mouths, too little surplus, and two peoples who had no shared framework for understanding what the other actually wanted. Granganimeo, the brother who had extended that first welcome, died sometime during this period. The exact circumstances are not clearly recorded, but his death removed one of the steadiest voices for accommodation with the English from Wingina's inner circle. Wanchese, who had returned from London, deeply suspicious of these visitors, was almost certainly working against Lane's colony from very early on, urging caution, urging resistance, urging Wingina to see the English not as a temporary curiosity, but as a standing threat. Lane, for his part, had brought a soldier's instincts to a situation that badly needed a diplomat's patience, and he did not have much of either patience or trust to spare. Late in the year, a disagreement over something as small, in the end, as a missing silver cup, a gift, or a piece of trade goods, taken from an English hand and not returned, would give Lane's deputies the excuse they were, in some sense, already looking for. What happened next would be the first real act of violence between the English and the Algonquian towns of this coast, and it would set a pattern that the entire following year could never fully escape. Blood at Aquasco Gawk. Before the fort on Roanoke was even finished, while Grenville's fleet was still working its way along the coastline, gathering information and trading with the towns it passed, a small English party came ashore at a town called Aquasco Gawk, further south along the mainland's edge. What happened there, in the middle of July 1585, is one of those moments in history that seems, on the surface, almost too small to matter, and that is exactly why it deserves to be told slowly and told honestly, without smoothing away how disproportionate it actually was. Sometime during that visit, a silver cup went missing. We don't know exactly how. It may have been taken deliberately. A piece of trade goods that someone in the town decided was worth more kept than returned. It may have been misplaced, or given as a gift, and then claimed back, or simply lost in the ordinary confusion of dozens of strangers moving through a town for the first time. The historical record, drawn almost entirely from English sources, doesn't tell us the town's side of the story at all, and that absence is itself worth sitting with for a moment. Because everything we know about what happened next comes from the people who did the burning, not the people whose homes were burned. A few days later, Grenville sent Philip Amadas, the same young captain who had sailed on the first, gentler expedition the year before, back to Aquascogoc with a group of armed men, specifically to recover the cup. When the town could not, or would not produce it, the English response was not a fine, not a hostage taken for ransom, not a formal complaint carried to Wingina as the region's paramount chief. It was fire. Amadas and his men burned the entire town to the ground, along with its standing crops of corn in the fields around it. In the height of the growing season, with no apparent hesitation, and, as far as the surviving accounts suggest, very little debate about whether the punishment fit whatever had actually occurred. It is worth being plain about what this meant, in practical terms, for the people of Aquascogoc. This was not a symbolic gesture. Burning a town's fields in July meant burning the food that town was counting on to survive the coming winter. For a single missing cup, an object of real but modest value, the kind of minor loss that, among the English themselves, would rarely have provoked more than an argument, an entire community lost its homes, and very likely, a meaningful part of the harvest it depended on to live through the cold months ahead. English accounts from the period frame the burning almost administratively, as a necessary demonstration that the English could not be treated carelessly, that any slight, however small, would be answered swiftly, so that the appearance of weakness would never again invite theft or disrespect. It is the logic of an occupying force, not of a guest, and by the time Amadas set that fire, whatever the newcomers had been the summer before, guests was no longer an honest word for what they had become. It helps, too, to place this single burning inside the wider pattern of how European colonial ventures across this era tended to treat perceived slights from the people whose land they were settling. Only 20 years earlier, a French Protestant colony in Florida had been wiped out almost entirely by Spanish forces who considered their mere presence, as heretics on Catholic-claimed soil, sufficient justification for slaughter. English colonists, watching from across the Channel, had been horrified by that massacre and had used it in their own writing as proof of Spanish cruelty compared to English restraint. And yet here, only a year into their own colonial venture, English soldiers had just burned a town and its harvest over a single missing cup. A far smaller provocation than anything the French colonists in Florida were accused of, met with a response that, while less bloody than outright massacre, followed the exact same underlying logic. That force, applied early and visibly, was the only language a new colonial power believed the people around it would respect. It is one of the quieter, less comfortable truths this story has to offer. That the empire building itself as the more civilized alternative to Spain was already, within its first year on this coast, reaching for the same tools. We don't know how Wingina or the wider network of towns along the Sound reacted to the news, not directly, not in their own words. But we can infer a great deal from what followed. Word of what had happened at Aquascogoc would have traveled quickly along the same trade and kinship networks that had, only a year before, welcomed Barlow's small crew so warmly. Every town within reach of that news now had a very different piece of information to weigh. The next time, English soldiers came ashore hungry, asking for food, expecting it to be given. Grenville himself did not stay long enough to manage the consequences. Having overseen the fort's construction and the colony's initial setup, he set sail back to England aboard the Tiger on the 25th of August, 1585, leaving Ralph Lane in full command of the 100-odd men who would remain through the winter. It's a detail worth holding on to, because it means the man who ordered the burning at Aquascogoc and the man who would spend the following year managing the fallout of that decision among increasingly wary and increasingly hostile towns were not the same person. Grenville sailed home to a comfortable reception in England, his role in the incident already fading into a single paragraph in someone else's report. Lane was the one left behind to live inside the consequences. There's a detail worth adding here, gently, for anyone who wants the fuller shape of what trade actually looked like between these two peoples before it curdled into fear and violence. Copper, as mentioned earlier, held a value among the Algonquian towns that surprised the English, who had expected gold or silver to be the obvious prize. Copper's importance wasn't simply decorative. Among many Eastern woodland cultures of this period, copper carried spiritual and political weight, associated with certain kinds of authority, ceremony, and connection to distant trade networks that had existed across the continent for centuries before any European ship arrived. When English traders offered copper freely in exchange for corn, furs, or information, they were, without fully realizing it, trading in a currency that meant something entirely different to the people receiving it than it meant to the people giving it away. That mismatch of meaning, two peoples using the same objects to conduct entirely different kinds of exchange, without ever quite translating what those exchanges signified to the other, sat underneath almost every interaction in this story, long before the burning at Aquascogoc turned that quiet mismatch into open injury. There is a temptation, telling a story like this one, to treat the burning of Aquascogoc as an isolated, contained event, a single bad decision, made and finished, with no lasting shadow. But that isn't how trust works, between people or between peoples, and it certainly isn't how it worked here. Every later encounter between Lane's men and the Algonquian towns of the region would happen in the shadow of what had already been done at Aquascogoc. Every request for food, every trade negotiation, every moment where an English soldier expected hospitality he had not earned, now carried the memory of a burned town behind it, whether anyone spoke that memory aloud or not. Ralph Lane's own later writing about this first year offers a useful, if uncomfortable, window into how the English rationalized moments like this one to themselves. In his reports back to Raleigh and to the wider English public, Lane tended to frame every act of English aggression as fundamentally defensive or corrective, a response to provocation rather than the cause of it, a pattern that runs consistently through his account of the entire year, from Aquascogoc through to the killing of Wingina that would follow it. It is worth reading that pattern skeptically, not because Lane was necessarily lying outright about specific events, but because he was, quite literally, the only person writing the official record, reporting his own conduct to the very patron whose continued financial support depended on believing that conduct had been justified. History, for long stretches of this story, survives only through the eyes of people with a very direct interest in how their own actions were remembered. It is also worth noting gently what this story is not. This is not a tale with a clean villain twirling a mustache, delighted by cruelty for its own sake. Amadas, by every account we have of him, was a capable, largely unremarkable young officer following what he understood to be a defensible chain of reasoning. A stolen object, an unmet demand for its return, a proportional seeming response drawn from a European playbook of military discipline that had no framework at all for the actual relationship England needed to build with the people whose land this already was. That is, in its own way, a more unsettling story than simple villainy would be. Most of the damage done across this entire history, not just here, but again and again across the following centuries of contact between Europeans and the people already living on this continent, was not the work of mustache-twirling cruelty. It was the ordinary, unremarkable violence of people who believed themselves entirely reasonable, applying a logic built for one world onto a world it was never designed to fit. By the time winter came, Lane's colony stood on ground that was no longer neutral. The towns around Roanoke had watched what English soldiers were willing to do for the sake of a single missing cup, and they would remember it through everything that followed. Through a winter of dwindling supplies, through a chief's growing conviction that these visitors intended to stay forever unless something changed, and through a decision made in the following spring that would end with a killing far larger than anything that had happened at Aquasco and far harder for either side to walk back from. The death of a chief. By the winter of 1585 into 86, Wingina had a decision to make, and it was not an easy one. He led a network of towns, now feeding 100 armed foreigners who showed no intention of ever leaving, who had already burned one town to ash over a missing cup, and who consumed food that his own people needed for themselves. According to Ralph Lane's own account, and it is worth remembering again and again through this part of the story, that Lane's account is the only detailed version we have, written by the man who would soon order a chief's death and had every reason to justify it afterward. Wingina began quietly to organize a different kind of resistance. Rather than open warfare, which his people had little hope of winning against English firearms, the plan Lane describes was slower, and in its way, more elegant. Simply stop feeding the English. Encourage the surrounding towns to withdraw from trade, to stop planting extra corn for the garrison, to let hunger do what weapons could not. A starving colony, forced to scatter into small foraging parties, searching for food across unfamiliar ground, would be far easier to pick off than 100 men standing together behind a fort's earthen walls. Whether this plan existed exactly as Lane described it, in this much detail, we cannot fully know. It survives only in the words of the man whose life depended on believing, and on persuading others to believe, that a decisive strike was the only option left to him. What we can say with more confidence is that relations between the colony and Wingina's towns had been deteriorating for months, that food had become an openly contested resource, and that both sides, by the spring of 1586, had good reason to distrust the other's intentions completely. It's worth noting, too, that by this point, Wingina had taken a new name for himself, Pemisapan, which some translations render loosely as the one who watches, or the one who is on guard. Names carried real significance across many Algonquian-speaking cultures, often shifting to reflect a person's changing circumstances, responsibilities, or state of mind, and a paramount chief choosing to rename himself something meaning watchfulness. In the exact season his people were quietly organizing resistance against an armed foreign garrison tells us something Lane's own written account never quite manages to say directly. That Wingina understood, with total clarity, exactly what kind of relationship this had become and exactly how carefully he now needed to move through it. Lane struck first. Acting on intelligence, real or exaggerated, we cannot fully separate the two. That Wingina was gathering allied warriors at Dasimunkapuch, a mainland town across the Sound from Roanoke. Lane led an armed party there on the 1st of June, 1586. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was closer to a raid aimed specifically at the town's leadership. Wingina, warned or simply reacting to the sudden appearance of armed Englishmen, fled into the surrounding woods. He did not escape. One of Lane's men, a colonist named Edward Nugent, pursued him, caught him, and killed him. And then, in a detail that English accounts record with the same flat, unbothered tone they use for nearly everything else in this story, returned carrying Wingina's head as proof of the deed. It is difficult to overstate what this moment meant for both peoples, though it meant very different things to each. To Lane and his men, it was a decisive, necessary strike against a chief they believed, rightly or wrongly, we cannot fully judge from this distance, was actively planning their destruction. To Wingina's people, it was the killing of their paramount leader, ambushed and beheaded by men his own brother had once fed with his own hands, 2 years before, on a beach that must have felt, by June of 1586, impossibly distant and impossibly naive in its warmth. Whatever fragile trust had survived the burning of Aquascogoc did not survive this. There was no path back from it for anyone who had known Wingina, and there was no reason left for any nearby town to extend the English anything but the coldest, most careful distance.
Word of Wingina's killing eventually reached England as well, folded into Lane's own report of the year's events, and it was received there, by and large, without much moral hand-wringing. To English readers back home, primed by years of Barlow's Golden Age imagery on one hand and rising anti-Spanish propaganda on the other, a colonial governor defending his men against a hostile chief's plot was simply a familiar, expected kind of story. Proof, if anything, that English resolve could match Spanish ruthlessness when the situation demanded it. There was no meaningful public reckoning in Lane's own lifetime with what had actually happened at Dasmun-Kepiuk, or with how thin the evidence for Wingina's supposed plot against the colony actually was, once you set aside Lane's own account of it. That kind of uncritical acceptance, repeated across so many similar moments in the broader history of European colonization, is itself worth naming plainly. An official report, written by the person who benefits most from being believed, too often simply became the historical record, with no one positioned to publish the other side of the story at all. Lane's colony now stood in an almost impossible position. They had killed the region's paramount chief. They had no meaningful food supply of their own, having depended for a full year on trade relationships that were now, obviously, in ruins. And the supply fleet that was supposed to arrive from England, restocking them for another year, was already badly overdue. It was into this moment, tense, hungry, isolated, and freshly stained with a killing that could not be undone, that an unexpected fleet appeared off the coast in early June, only days after Wingina's death. It was not the relief fleet Lane had been waiting for. It was Sir Francis Drake, the famous English privateer, returning from a long, brutally successful raiding campaign against Spanish settlements across the Caribbean, and stopping at Roanoke, seemingly by prior arrangement or simple opportunity, to check on the colony's progress. Drake offered real, substantial help. He proposed leaving Lane a ship, along with supplies and additional men, enough to let the colony continue for another year if it chose to, or if Lane preferred, to carry the entire colony home to England aboard his fleet. Lane, weighing the colony's dwindling food, the collapse of trust with every nearby town, and the growing likelihood of retaliation for Wingina's death, chose to accept Drake's offer of continued support. For a little while, at least. And then the coast that had already wrecked one ship in Grenville's fleet the year before struck again. A sudden, violent storm blew in off the Atlantic, scattering Drake's fleet and destroying the very ship he had promised to leave behind, along with much of the supplies meant to sustain the colony through another winter. Faced with a wrecked promise, a hostile mainland, and a fleet that could right now carry every one of his men safely home, Lane made the decision that would end the first Roanoke colony. He abandoned the settlement entirely, and on the 19th of June, 1586, he and his surviving men boarded Drake's ships and sailed for England. They left behind the fort, whatever supplies remained, and, in a detail almost too poignant not to mention, the first Roanoke colony's careful year of scientific observation, exploration, and, ultimately, violence, ended not with a triumphant return, but with a somewhat undignified evacuation, timed almost exactly wrong. Because only days after Lane's ships disappeared over the horizon, a supply ship sent by Raleigh finally arrived at Roanoke, loaded with provisions for the colony it expected to find waiting. It found the fort empty. After searching the area without success and waiting for some sign of the missing colonists, the ship's captain eventually sailed home again, taking the supplies back with him, since there was no one left on that island to receive them. Shortly after that, Grenville himself arrived with yet another fleet, arriving to find the same discovery: an abandoned fort, no colonists, no clear explanation of what had happened. Unwilling to let England's claim to the territory lapse entirely, and unable to track down Lane's whereabouts, Grenville decided on his own. He left behind a small holding party. The numbers recorded between 15 and 18 men, depending on the source, with instructions to maintain a presence on Roanoke Island and preserve England's claim to the land until a proper colony could be organized and sent. It is worth sitting for a moment with how this first colony's story actually ends, because it so rarely gets remembered as anything other than a quiet footnote to the more famous vanishing that would follow it a year later. 100 soldiers crossed an ocean, built a fort, mapped a coastline, painted its people and its plants in careful watercolor, burned a town over a cup, killed a chief who had once fed them with his own hands, and then left in a hurried, almost accidental evacuation, rescued by a privateer's fleet that happened to be passing by at exactly the right, or exactly the wrong, moment. Nothing about that ending was planned. Nothing about it was resolved. It simply stopped. The way a conversation stops when one person walks out of the room mid-sentence, and it left behind a fort, a claim on paper, and 15 or 18 men with no real chance of holding either one alone. Those men would not be heard from again by any English voice for over a year. And when the next group of English colonists finally arrived to relieve them, in the summer of 1587, what they found waiting on that quiet, marshy island would be the first real physical evidence that this particular stretch of coast did not forgive mistakes, and did not forget them either. A colony of families. Raleigh had learned something from the failure of Lane's colony, even if he wasn't willing to give up on the wider project. A garrison of soldiers with no long-term stake in the land, no families, and no farms of their own, had produced exactly what soldiers with no long-term stake tend to produce: short-term thinking, quick violence, and a colony that fell apart the moment it stopped being convenient. So for his third attempt, Raleigh tried something different. He organized a true civilian colony. Men, yes, but also their wives and children, people who intended not to raid or garrison or search for gold, but to build homes, plant fields, and stay. He recruited roughly 115 to 118 colonists, families among them, and he gave the settlement a name that sounded less like a military outpost and more like a genuine permanent town, the city of Raleigh in Virginia. And to lead it, he chose the one man from the previous expedition whose relationship with this land had always been about observation and care rather than conquest. The artist, John White, who had spent the previous year painting careful, patient watercolors of Algonquian towns and people. White was made governor, along with 12 assistants who would help him manage the colony's affairs, and among the families who sailed with him was his own daughter, Eleanor, married to a colonist named Ananias Dare, and pregnant with a child who would be born before the year was out on the very island her grandfather now governed. Among the 12 assistants chosen to help White govern the colony, several were granted their own coats of arms as part of the venture's formal charter, a small but telling detail about how seriously Raleigh and the Queen's Court intended this settlement to be taken, not as a rough frontier camp, but as the seed of a genuine, permanent English town with its own local gentry and its own claim to lasting status back home. It is easy, looking back from 4 centuries later at a colony remembered mostly for vanishing, to forget how much formal hope and formal paperwork went into its founding, how carefully its structure was designed to last for generations, not months. The fleet left Plymouth in May of 1587, under the navigation of a pilot named Simon Fernandez, and the plan, on paper, was clear. They were not meant to settle at Roanoke at all. Lane's difficult year had made clear that Roanoke's location, shallow, hard to reach by deep draft ships, surrounded by towns whose trust had already been badly damaged, was a poor site for a permanent town. The new colonists were instructed to sail past Roanoke, stop only briefly to collect the 15 men Grenville had left behind the year before, to hold England's claim, and then continue north to the Chesapeake Bay, where deeper water and, crucially, a fresh start with towns who had no memory of Aquascogok or Wingina's death offered a far better foundation. That plan did not survive contact with Simon Fernandez. When the fleet reached Roanoke in July of 1587, and White's men went ashore to gather the 15 holding party men and continue toward the Chesapeake as instructed, Fernandez refused to let the colonists reboard his ships to continue the journey. Historians have fully settled his exact reasoning. The most widely accepted explanation is timing. It was already midsummer, and Fernandez, as a privateer as much as a pilot, was eager to get back out into open water while the season for raiding Spanish shipping was still good, rather than spend more weeks ferrying families up the coast to a second unfamiliar landing site. Whatever his reasons, his decision was final, and it was not one the colonists had any real power to overturn. Whether they liked it or not, the city of Raleigh would be built at Roanoke after all, on the exact ground where the previous colony had collapsed into violence and abandonment barely a year before. The crossing itself had already tested this new colony's resolve before it ever reached land. Ships of this period were cramped, damp, and unpredictable places to spend 2 months at sea, and a fleet carrying entire families, infants, elderly relatives, pregnant women among them, faced a very different set of risks than the mostly young, mostly able-bodied soldiers who had crossed 2 years earlier. Sickness moved quickly through crowded quarters. Fresh water and food had to stretch further and be rationed more carefully, with more mouths and less certainty about resupply along the way. By the time the fleet reached the Outer Banks in July, everyone aboard had already endured a genuinely difficult ocean crossing, and the news that they would not, after all, be continuing on to the fresh start promised at the Chesapeake, but would instead be settling on ground already marked by fire and by a chief's death, must have landed as a second, entirely unwelcome hardship layered directly on top of the first. What they found waiting for them on that ground was not reassuring. The fort Lane's men had built stood empty and half-ruined, its palisade broken down in places, deer wandering freely through houses that had once sheltered 100 English soldiers. And searching the site, White's men found something more troubling still: the scattered bones of one man, evidently one of the 15 left behind by Grenville, lying where he had fallen, with no burial, no marker, nothing but the bones themselves to tell the story of what had happened to him. The full story, as much of it as the English ever pieced together, came later through Manteo, who had once again sailed with this expedition as guide and interpreter, maintaining even now the loyalty to the English that had defined him since that first voyage back in 1584. According to what Manteo relayed, the 15 holding party men had not simply vanished quietly. At some point after Grenville's fleet sailed away, a group of roughly 30 warriors, likely allied with one Chase, whose distrust of the English had never wavered, and whose position among the surviving towns had likely strengthened considerably after Wingina's death left a gap in local leadership, approached the small English garrison under the pretense of a friendly visit. During that visit, one Englishman was killed. The rest, apparently caught off guard and heavily outnumbered, retreated to their boats and rowed to a small nearby island to regroup and wait out the danger. What happened after that is less clear. The most consistent account suggests the men eventually tried to return to the mainland or to Roanoke itself, possibly to gather more supplies or attempt an escape by larger boat, and were ambushed again. Some were killed outright, the rest scattered, and their ultimate fate, whether they died of exposure and starvation, were killed in further skirmishes, or, in a possibility this story will return to later, were absorbed into a nearby community that took them in, was never definitively established by any English record. This was the welcome, then, that greeted 115 men, women, and children who had crossed an ocean expecting, at the very least, 15 living countrymen to meet them and help establish the beginnings of a real town. Instead, they found broken bones and an abandoned fort on an island whose relationship with the surrounding towns had already been poisoned by 2 acts of violence, a burned village and a beheaded chief, that none of these new arrivals had any part in, but all of them would now have to live with the consequences of. Among the ordinary colonists who made this crossing were people whose names survive today only as entries on a passenger roster, glimpsed for a moment and then folded back into the general uncertainty of everything that followed. Ananias Dare, Eleanor's husband and soon-to-be Virginia's father, was recorded as a bricklayer and tiler by trade, one of the 12 assistants granted a coat of arms under the colony's charter, a detail that hints at real upward mobility and real ambition wrapped up in this crossing, a tradesman's family reaching, quite literally, for a title and a stake in a brand-new town of their own making. Dionys Harvey, another of the assistants, and his wife Marjorie, whose son would be born within days of Virginia Dare, appear in the record with similarly thin detail, a name, a role, a rough sketch of a life, and then silence. It is worth remembering, reading a story like this one, that behind every dry list of names in a ship's roster was a full, complicated human life, with its own reasons for risking an ocean crossing toward an uncertain future, reasons the surviving documents rarely bother to record.
White, to his credit, tried immediately to do what Lane never had: repair the relationship rather than escalate it. He understood, better than most of his fellow colonists, just how much damage the previous year's violence had done, and he understood that his colony's survival depended entirely on rebuilding some version of the trust that had existed briefly and imperfectly back in 1584. Manteo would be central to that effort, standing as he so often did in the difficult space between two worlds that increasingly had very little reason left to trust one another. But trust, once broken by fire and by a chief's severed head, does not rebuild itself quickly or easily or on anyone's convenient timeline. And the families now settling into the ruins of Lane's old fort would have precious little time to find out whether it could be rebuilt at all before the next crisis arrived:
a peace offering and a birth. Only weeks after the new colonists arrived, before John White had any real chance to begin the slow work of rebuilding trust, the fragile peace he was reaching for broke apart again. On the 28th of July, 1587, one of White's 12 assistants, a man named George Howe, went out alone, unarmed, to a marshy area not far from the fort to gather crabs for the colony's supper. It was the kind of small, ordinary errand that 100 other colonists on 100 other days must have run without incident. Howe did not return. When a search party found him, he had been killed, struck down, according to the surviving account, by a group of warriors who shot him with arrows, and then, once he had fallen, struck his head repeatedly with wooden clubs. We don't know with certainty who was responsible, though the English at the time believed almost immediately that the attack came from Juan Chase's people at Dasamunkapiuk, the same mainland town where Wingina had been killed the year before. It is not a hard conclusion to understand. Dasamunkapiuk had every reason, by this point, to see any Englishman found alone and unarmed as a target rather than a neighbor, and Juan Chase himself had spent 3 years building exactly that kind of resolve against the newcomers who had burned a town, killed a chief, and now, once again, expected to be welcomed. White's response, understandably, was to seek some kind of justice. But what followed is one of the most quietly tragic episodes in this entire story, and it deserves to be told honestly, without smoothing over how badly it went. On the 9th of August, White organized a retaliatory raid against Dasamunkapiuk, guided once again by Manteo, who agreed to lead English soldiers against the very people whose language and world he had grown up in service of the loyalty he had built with the English over 3 years and 2 ocean crossings. The raiding party set out before dawn and approached the town in darkness, planning to strike before the occupants could organize any defense. What they found when they attacked was not the war party they expected. The town had already been abandoned by whatever warriors might have been responsible for Howe's death, and in their place, English soldiers found a small group of people who had come to the site to gather corn and other crops still growing in the abandoned fields. People from Croatoan, Manteo's own home community, who had traveled to Dasamunkapiuk for entirely peaceful reasons and had no connection at all to Howe's killing. In the darkness and confusion, the English opened fire before anyone could be identified. 1 man was killed. Others were wounded. It was only once the fighting stopped that anyone realized the terrible mistake that had just been made. that the raid meant to answer one killing had produced another, and that the people harmed by it were, if anything, among the English colony's few remaining genuine allies. There is no way to tell this part of the story without acknowledging how much damage it did, and not only to the people directly killed and wounded. Manteo, who had spent 3 years building bridges between two worlds that trusted each other less with every passing season, had just led an attack, however unintentional, against his own community. Whatever this raid was meant to accomplish, it did not restore safety to the colony, and it did not undo George Howe's death. It only added one more layer of grief and mistrust to a relationship that had very little of either left to spare. Baptism, for an Algonquian leader like Manteo, was never a simple, one-directional act of religious conversion, whatever the English colonists themselves believed they were witnessing. It was also, inescapably, a political gesture, a public alignment with the English crown and the English god, performed in front of both English colonists and, presumably, whatever Algonquian observers were present or would later hear of it, at a moment when the practical, worldly benefits of that alignment for Manteo personally were genuinely uncertain. He had already lost standing among some of his own people for his closeness to the English. He had led, however unwillingly, an attack that killed members of his own community by mistake. And now he was formally, ceremonially binding himself even more tightly to the very colonists whose presence on this coast had brought so much of that grief in the first place. Manteo's choices throughout this entire story resist easy summary. He was neither a simple collaborator nor a simple victim of circumstance. He was a man navigating an impossibly narrow path between two worlds that increasingly had no room left for anyone standing in the middle of both. It's worth pausing here to consider what these weeks must have felt like from the inside for the ordinary colonists who were neither soldiers nor diplomats, simply families who had crossed an ocean expecting a fresh start. They had arrived to find bones instead of the 15 countrymen they'd been promised. They had watched their governor organize a raid that killed the wrong people. And they had every reason, at this point, to wonder whether the peace their own survival depended on could ever really be rebuilt, or whether they had simply inherited, without ever choosing it themselves, a conflict two earlier expeditions had already made nearly impossible to undo. And yet, in the middle of this same difficult stretch of days, the colony also marked two moments that stood deliberately in a very different register. On the 13th of August, 1587, Manteo was baptized into the Church of England, the first person of his nation, by the record we have, to receive that sacrament in the English colonial venture in the Americas. Alongside the baptism, and very much as a reward for years of loyalty that had, by this point, cost him more than any of the English fully understood, Raleigh had instructed White to grant Manteo an English title, Lord of Roanoke and Dasamunkapuk, in reward for his faithful service. It was, in real terms, a largely symbolic gesture, an English honor granted according to English custom, over land and people whose own systems of leadership and belonging had never worked anything like an English lordship. But symbolic or not, it marked Manteo as something unique in this entire story. The one figure trusted, honored, and relied upon by both peoples at once, even as the space between those two peoples grew narrower and more dangerous with every passing week. 5 days after that, on the 18th of August, the colony marked a very different kind of milestone. Eleanor Dare, John White's own daughter, gave birth to a daughter of her own, a girl who would be christened in honor of the land itself, Virginia. She was the first English child recorded as being born anywhere in the Americas, and her birth in the middle of a colony surrounded by grief, mistrust, and the still fresh memory of 2 recent killings must have felt to the exhausted colonists gathered around her like the one unambiguously good thing this entire difficult year had produced. We know almost nothing else about Virginia Dare as an individual. No later document, no diary entry, no letter describes her as a toddler, a child, or anything beyond the newborn infant christened in that record. Everything written or imagined about her life beyond her first weeks, every painting, every statue, every romantic later legend of a girl who grew up wild among the Croatoan, transformed by folklore into a white doe roaming the Carolina woods, is invention, layered on top of an absence, by writers and artists working centuries after her actual birth, filling a silence with whatever story felt most satisfying to tell. The real Virginia Dare, the one whose birth genuinely happened on this island in 1587, exists in the historical record for exactly 1 sentence, and then simply stops, the same way the rest of her colony's story eventually does. Only days later, another colonist's wife, Marjorie Harvey, gave birth to a son as well, though far less is recorded of that second birth than of Virginia Dare's, whose name and story would go on to outlive every other detail of this colony by centuries, becoming eventually the one fact about Roanoke that almost every American schoolchild would learn, long after the rest of this history had faded into obscurity. It is worth pausing here, in this strange, suspended moment, before the story moves forward into everything that followed. In the span of about 3 weeks, this small, struggling colony had buried a murdered man, mistakenly killed an ally, baptized and honored its most loyal friend, and welcomed its first newborn child into the world. All of it happened on the same small island, among the same 115 people, none of whom had any way of knowing that this crowded, grief-laden, hopeful month was very nearly the last one any of them would spend together as a single, unified community. Because within days, the colony's leadership would face a decision that would split them apart, sending their governor back across an ocean he did not want to cross, and leaving everyone else behind to face whatever came next, alone. The governor sails away. Even as the colony celebrated Virginia Dare's birth, a harder problem was pressing on everyone's mind. The fleet that had brought them here was preparing to sail home, and the colony, still finding its footing, badly needed more supplies than it had brought with it. More tools, more clothing, more food to see them through until their own crops could be relied upon, and more colonists, ideally, to strengthen a settlement that had already lost its safety margin twice over. First to Simon Fernandez's stubborn refusal to sail on to the Chesapeake, and then to the deaths of George Howe and the unnamed man from Croatoan. Someone needed to return to England to make that case in person, to Raleigh and to the investors whose money and attention this colony still depended on entirely. The colonists debated who that person should be, and the debate, as White himself recorded it, grew heated. Several of the assistants pushed hard for White to go himself, arguing that he alone had the standing, the relationship with Raleigh, and the credibility to secure supplies and additional colonists quickly, rather than risk delay, misunderstanding, or outright theft if lesser-known men were sent in his place, carrying reports that might be doubted or simply ignored by investors who had never met them. Try, for a moment, to sit inside that argument the way White must have experienced it. He was not being asked to abandon his people. Everyone involved, including White himself, seems to have genuinely believed this was the fastest, safest path to getting real help back to the colony. And yet the request being made of him was still enormous. Leave behind a newborn granddaughter, not yet 3 weeks old. Leave behind a daughter who had just given birth on unfamiliar, contested ground. Leave behind more than 100 people he had spent months learning to lead and trust that an ocean crossing, a difficult negotiation with investors back home, and a return voyage could all be completed quickly enough to matter. White resisted. He had a daughter here, newly delivered of her first child. He had a granddaughter not yet 2 weeks old. He had spent by this point several years of his life devoted to painting, documenting, and now governing this fragile settlement, and every instinct he had as both a leader and a grandfather argued against leaving now at the exact moment his family and his colony needed him most. But the assistants pressed their case, framing his departure not as abandonment, but as the single most useful thing he could do for the colony's survival. And eventually, reluctantly, White agreed. Before he left, the colonists and White settled on something practical, a plan for how the colony might communicate with whoever returned to find it, in case circumstances changed while White was away. If the settlers were forced, for any reason, to relocate from Roanoke Island, a real possibility, given how badly this location had already served 2 separate colonies, they agreed to carve the name of their new location into a conspicuous tree or post, somewhere any search party would be certain to find it. And if that move happened under duress, if the colony was forced to leave in danger rather than by simple choice, they agreed to add one more mark above the carved name, a cross, cut clearly into the wood, a silent signal readable by anyone who understood the arrangement, without any need for further explanation. It is a small, almost bureaucratic detail, a prearranged signal agreed on in a hurried conversation before a ship's departure, and it would go on to matter more than almost anything else these colonists ever wrote down, because it is nearly the only piece of information the vanished colony ever left behind for the people who came looking for them. Everything that happened after White sailed away, every theory, every excavation, every argument that has stretched across 4 centuries ultimately circles back to that one small agreement. A name carved into wood, with or without a cross above it. White departed Roanoke on the 27th of August, 1587, sailing with Simon Fernandez's fleet, leaving behind roughly 115 colonists. His daughter, his infant granddaughter, and everyone else who had crossed the ocean with him that spring, all of them now his responsibility to provision, resupply, and eventually bring safely home, or bring more colonists to join. It was, by every account of White's own later writing, one of the hardest decisions of his life, and he would spend the following 3 years trying again and again to undo it, to get back across that ocean, back to that island, back to the family he had left behind on the promise of a quick resupply mission. In his own later account of these events, White would describe himself as leaving with great unwillingness, weighed down by concern for his own family and for the colony as a whole, a phrase that, stripped of its formal 16th century phrasing, reads very simply as a grandfather forcing himself to walk away from people he loved, trusting a plan he had no way of controlling once he stepped aboard that ship. He does not appear to have imagined in that moment that he was seeing any of them for the last time. Every letter and account he left behind afterward suggests a man who fully expected to be back within a matter of months, carrying tools, food, and fresh colonists, resuming his role as governor, as though this was simply a brief practical interruption rather than the opening of a 3-year absence that would end in nothing but silence, a carved word, and a lifetime of unresolved grief. There was real risk in the crossing itself, quite apart from anything waiting on either shore. Late-season Atlantic voyages of this period were genuinely dangerous undertakings, at the mercy of storms, disease below decks, and the basic unreliability of 16th-century navigation across open water with no fixed way to measure longitude. Fernandez's fleet was also, by this point in the sailing season, moving through waters where privateering and the threat of hostile Spanish patrols added another layer of danger on top of the weather itself. White was not simply choosing to leave his family behind for a bureaucratic errand. He was gambling his own life on a return crossing twice over, in hopes of shortening a hardship for people he loved even more than he feared that risk to himself. The crossing back to England was difficult in its own right. Fernandez's ship struggled against poor winds and rough seas, and White arrived in England in November of 1587, later than planned and already anxious about how quickly he could turn around and sail back. What he found waiting for him in England, though, had nothing to do with weather or supplies or the colonists he had left behind. It was a country bracing for war. Spain, under King Philip II, was assembling what would become known as the Spanish Armada, a massive invasion fleet intended to crush English naval power once and for all, and, in the process, put an end to England's growing habit of raiding Spanish treasure ships and meddling in Spain's colonial ambitions across the Atlantic. Every English ship of any real size, along with every experienced sailor who could be found, was being requisitioned by the Crown for national defense. Queen Elizabeth's government had no interest in sparing ships for a small, distant colonial resupply mission. However urgently John White pleaded his case, when the very survival of England itself seemed to hang on every vessel it could put to sea. White would spend the better part of the next year simply trying to get permission to sail back to Roanoke at all, a fight he would eventually win, in a fashion, but not before the war with Spain had already cost him something no amount of persistence could recover: time. Every month White spent stranded in England arguing his case, watching ships he needed be claimed instead for the war effort, was a month his daughter, his granddaughter, and everyone else on that island spent alone waiting for a return that kept receding further and further into an uncertain future none of them could have predicted. A war that wasn't theirs. By the spring of 1588, John White had spent months pressing his case in London, watching one ship after another get pulled into the Crown's growing war fleet and slowly coming to understand just how small his colony's needs looked against the scale of what England believed it was facing. Spain's Armada, when it finally set sail that summer, would number well over 100 ships and tens of thousands of men. An invasion force built to end England's independence outright. Against a threat of that size, 115 colonists on a distant island, however real their need, simply could not compete for the attention, money, or vessels of a government convinced its own survival was at stake. Raleigh, to his credit, did not entirely abandon the effort. He managed to arrange for 2 small vessels, modest pinnaces, too small and too lightly built to be of any real use to the war fleet, and therefore among the few ships available for a colonial resupply mission at all. They were named the Brave and the Roe, and in April of 1588, White finally set sail again for Roanoke, carrying what supplies could be spared and, for the first time since his own departure, real hope that he might soon see his daughter and granddaughter again. That hope did not survive the crossing. The captains of both small ships, it turned out, were more interested in the potential profits of privateering than in the comparatively unglamorous work of delivering supplies to a struggling colony. And somewhere along the voyage, they diverted from their course to pursue what they judged to be an easy target. A French vessel spotted at sea that looked worth the risk of engagement. It was not an easy target. The resulting battle went badly for the English ships, both of which were seriously damaged. Their crews wounded, White himself was injured in the fighting, and their cargo, including the supplies meant for Roanoke, was largely plundered or lost in the chaos. Unable to continue the voyage, both ships limped back to England, arriving in May of 1588, without ever coming within sight of the American coast at all. It is difficult to overstate how badly this single decision, a detour chosen by two ship captains chasing a quick prize rather than completing the mission they had actually been sent to carry out, set back the entire colony's chances of timely rescue. White had finally secured ships. He had finally been given the chance to cross the ocean again, and that chance had been thrown away in a matter of hours, for a fight that had nothing to do with Roanoke at all, leaving the colonists on that island with no supplies, no reinforcements, and, though none of them could have known it yet, no contact whatsoever from England for 2 more years. It's worth understanding briefly just how total this national mobilization actually was, because it helps explain why a governor with a royal patent and a genuinely sympathetic patron in Raleigh could still spend years failing to secure a single working ship. England in the late 1580s had nothing resembling the standing naval infrastructure of later centuries. Ships were requisitioned from merchants, refitted for war on short notice, and crewed by sailors pulled from ordinary commercial and fishing work, all under direct royal order, with penalties for any captain or ship owner who tried to hold vessels back for private business instead. Against the specter of a 130-ship Spanish invasion fleet, threatening not a distant colony, but the survival of the English crown itself, a governor's plea for 2 or 3 vessels to resupply 100 settlers on the other side of the ocean simply could not compete for priority, no matter how genuinely Raleigh or the Queen's ministers may have sympathized with his case. The summer that followed brought the crisis White had been fighting so hard to avoid contributing to. In July and August of 1588, the Spanish Armada finally sailed against England, and the ensuing battle, fought partly in open combat along the English Channel and partly by the weather itself, as a series of brutal storms scattered and wrecked much of what remained of the Spanish fleet as it tried to limp home around the British Isles, became one of the defining military victories in English history. It secured England's independence, humiliated Spain's naval power for a generation, and it consumed, for the better part of 2 years, nearly every resource, every ship, and every ounce of the Crown's attention that might otherwise have gone toward a small, struggling colony on the other side of the ocean. Raleigh, meanwhile, was quietly restructuring his own relationship to the entire colonial venture in ways that would end up mattering a great deal. In 1589, still deep in the aftermath of the Armada campaign, and facing his own mounting financial pressures, Raleigh transferred much of his patent and his colonial rights to a group of London merchants and investors, who came to be known collectively as the Assigns, on the explicit condition that they continue supporting the Roanoke colonists and the broader Virginia enterprise. It was, in effect, an early attempt to spread both the financial burden and the responsibility for rescue across more shoulders than Raleigh's alone. Sensible business practice in ordinary circumstances, but one more layer of bureaucracy and divided attention standing between the colonists on that island and the ship that might have reached them sooner, had a singularly motivated patron still held every string himself. It is worth remembering just how much this same war reshaped ordinary life across all of England during these years. Not only the fate of one distant colony. Coastal towns braced for invasion. Militias were mustered in counties that had never expected to see combat on their own soil. Beacon fires were prepared along hilltops from Cornwall to Kent, ready to be lit in a chain the moment Spanish sails were sighted, carrying warning inland faster than any rider could travel. Ordinary families across England spent that summer of 1588 in a state of genuine nationwide dread, uncertain whether they would wake to find a foreign army already ashore. Set against that backdrop, it becomes a little easier to understand, even if it doesn't make it any less painful, why a single colonial governor's repeated pleas for a resupply ship struggled to gain traction. White was not simply unlucky or poorly connected. He was asking a nation gripped by existential fear to spare resources for a cause that, however much it may have mattered to him personally, looked from London's vantage point very small indeed. White did not stop trying, even as the war made every attempt harder than the last. He petitioned Raleigh again and again. He tried to secure passage on other ships bound anywhere near the Virginia coast, hoping to hitch a resupply mission onto someone else's voyage, rather than waiting for a dedicated one to be organized from scratch. Raleigh, for his part, seems to have remained genuinely committed to the colony's survival, at least in principle. He would go on, in the years that followed, to transfer his colonial rights to a group of London merchants, specifically on the condition that they continue supporting Roanoke. But commitment in principle and an actual ship crossing the Atlantic were two very different things. And for nearly 3 full years after White first sailed home in the autumn of 1587, they never quite came together. Meanwhile, on Roanoke Island, 115 colonists, minus however many had been lost to illness, accident, or conflict in the meantime, numbers no surviving record actually tells us, waited through winters and summers with no word from England at all, no way of knowing whether they had been forgotten, whether their governor was alive or dead, whether the ship that would finally carry supplies back to them was still coming, or had been lost entirely to a war they had no part in and no way of following. Whatever decisions they made during those silent years, whether to stay at Roanoke or move somewhere safer, whether to lean more heavily on their few remaining Algonquian allies or strike out further on their own, were made entirely without their governor's guidance and entirely without any way of telling the outside world what they had decided, except for the single agreed-upon signal carved into a post or a tree waiting for someone to come and read it. That someone eventually would be White himself, older, more desperate, and finally in possession of a ship arriving back at the island he had left 3 years earlier, with no idea until the very last moment what he would find waiting for him there. 3 years, 1 word. By the time White finally secured passage in 1590, he had spent close to 1,000 nights not knowing whether his daughter and granddaughter were alive, sick, starving, or already gone. The war with Spain that had stolen those years from him had by this point faded into a kind of victorious memory for most of England. The Armada defeated, the country's independence secured, London's attention already moving on to new concerns. For White alone, among nearly everyone he knew, those same years had not been a triumph to celebrate. They had been an unbroken stretch of waiting, made worse by the fact that he had no way of even sending word ahead, no way of telling his family, if they were still alive, to receive any message at all, that he had never stopped trying to come back. It took John White nearly 3 full years to find a ship that would actually carry him back to Roanoke, and even then it came with conditions that had nothing to do with the colony he was desperate to reach. In the spring of 1590, White finally secured passage aboard a small fleet of privateering ships under a merchant named John Watts, bound primarily for the Caribbean to raid Spanish shipping, with a stop at Roanoke agreed to only as a secondary favor along the way, not the mission's purpose, but a detour White had spent years begging for the chance to make. Even that agreement nearly cost him everything. The privateer's priority, as it had been for the ill-fated Brave and the Roe 2 years earlier, was profit, not delivery. And White spent much of the voyage watching his hoped-for detour to Roanoke get pushed further and further down the fleet's actual list of priorities, delayed again and again by the far more lucrative business of chasing Spanish prizes across the Caribbean first. By the time the fleet finally turned north toward the Outer Banks, it was already the middle of August, 3 years, almost to the week, since White had last stood on that island and said goodbye to his daughter and granddaughter. On the 15th of August, 1590, White's ships anchored off the coast near Roanoke. It was, though he may not have marked the coincidence in his own writing, almost exactly Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. That night, from the ships, the crew spotted a column of smoke rising from the direction of the island, a fire, somewhere near where the colony had once stood, and it must have felt in that moment like the first real sign of hope White had been given in 3 long years. Smoke meant people. People meant that somewhere out there, in the dark, his family might still be waiting. Bad weather and treacherous shoals delayed the landing by another full day. When White and a small party finally rowed ashore on the 17th, following the smoke toward what they hoped would be a joyful reunion, they found nothing but a spreading grass fire, likely started naturally, with no one tending it and no one nearby. There was no colony waiting at that spot at all. The next morning, the 18th of August, Virginia Dare's actual 3rd birthday, though there is no record that anyone on that boat was thinking of dates just then, White's party rowed to the north end of Roanoke Island, to the exact site where he had left his colony 3 years before. What they found was not a scene of violence. There was no blood, no scattered bodies, no sign of a struggle or a battle fought and lost. What they found instead was something stranger, and in its own way more unsettling. An empty settlement, carefully, deliberately dismantled. The houses had been taken down, not burned or wrecked, but disassembled, as though the people who once lived in them had methodically removed what could be carried and left the rest behind on purpose. A strong new palisade of tree trunks had been built around the site since White's departure, suggesting the colonists had spent real time and effort fortifying the location against some threat at some point during those 3 silent years. Digging near the site, White's men uncovered several chests that he recognized immediately as his own, buried, he believed, by the colonists specifically to keep them safe until his return. They had not stayed safe. The chests had been dug up at some point by someone, their contents scattered and ruined, his books torn apart and rotted by rain and weather, his maps and pictures spoiled beyond recovery, a suit of armor left rusting where it had been thrown aside. Whether this was the work of the colonists themselves retrieving what they needed before their departure and discarding what they couldn't carry, or the work of some later visitor to the abandoned site, White had no way to know for certain, and neither, in truth, do we. And then there was the carving. On one of the fort's support posts, in clear, deliberately formed capital letters, someone had cut a single word: Croatoan. On a nearby tree, an unfinished version of the same message had been started and abandoned, just the letters C-R-O, as though whoever carved it had begun again on a second surface, perhaps for clarity, perhaps simply out of caution, before finishing the fuller word nearby. Picture the scene as White himself must have experienced it, walking through what had once been the heart of his colony. The last time he had stood here, this ground had held the ordinary noise of a working settlement. Children, cook fires, hammering, the particular sound of more than 100 people going about the small, unremarkable business of daily survival. Now there was only wind moving through a fortified but empty enclosure, the marks of careful, unhurried dismantling, rather than sudden catastrophe, and waiting on a post at roughly eye level, a single word left specifically, deliberately, for him to find. Every account of this moment that survives, including White's own, describes a strange mixture of dread and relief settling over the search party as they realized what they were looking at. Dread, because the colony was unmistakably gone, but relief, because gone, on this particular evidence, did not appear to mean dead. White understood immediately what he was looking at. It was exactly the signal he and the colonists had agreed upon 3 years before, on the day he sailed away. If they were forced to relocate, they would carve the name of their new location somewhere prominent, and if that move happened under distress or danger, they would add a cross above it, a mark that anyone returning could read as a warning. There was no cross carved anywhere near either version of the word. By the exact terms of the agreement White himself had helped design, this was not a message of catastrophe. It was closer to the opposite. A plain, calm note, left for whoever came looking, telling them exactly where to find the people who had gone. Croatoan meant one place, and only one place. The island to the south, where Manteo's own people lived. The same community whose members had been mistakenly killed during the disastrous raid on Dasamunkapiuks 3 years earlier, and who, despite that tragedy, remained the colony's closest and most trusted ally among all the Algonquian towns of the region. If the colonists had chosen to leave a message pointing anywhere, Croatoan was, in almost every sense, the most hopeful possible answer. It suggested not disaster, but a deliberate, planned move toward safety, toward people they knew, people connected to Manteo, people who might take in 100 struggling English families running low on supplies and options after 3 years without contact from home. White wanted, more than almost anything in his life up to that point, to sail immediately for Croatoan and see for himself. He very nearly got the chance. But the same coastline that had already wrecked ships ruined food stores, and delayed rescue missions for years struck once more, almost as if the story itself refused to end simply. As White's fleet prepared to make the short journey south to Croatoan, a violent storm rolled in off the Atlantic, driving the ships from their anchorage, snapping cables, and forcing the crews into a dangerous, exhausting fight simply to keep from being wrecked on the very shoals they were trying to sail past. One anchor was lost entirely. The ship's fresh water supply, already limited, was contaminated or run critically low in the chaos, and the fleet's commander, whose actual priority all along had been the Caribbean prizes still waiting further south, made the final call that White, with no ship or authority of his own, had no power to overrule. They would not risk the ships any further on a search that had already cost them time, water, and an anchor. They would sail on toward the Caribbean, toward the mission the fleet had actually been financed to complete. John White never set foot on Roanoke Island again. He never reached Croatoan. He never learned, with any certainty, what had become of his daughter, his son-in-law, his granddaughter, or the more than 100 other men, women, and children he had governed, and then left, and then spent 3 desperate years trying to return to. All he carried home with him, across an ocean he would never cross again, was a single carved word, and the terrible, permanent uncertainty of not knowing whether it had led anywhere at all. The man who never stopped looking. John White sailed back to England in the autumn of 1590, carrying almost nothing of what he had gone to find. No daughter, no granddaughter, no answers beyond a single word carved into a post, and a storm that had taken the choice of following it out of his hands. What he carried instead was grief, and a stubborn, aching hope that refused to fully die even after every practical avenue for acting on it had closed. We know how deeply this loss sat with him because he wrote about it in a letter to Richard Hakluyt, a geographer and writer who was compiling accounts of English exploration for publication. White's letter, later printed in 1593, is one of the most quietly devastating documents to survive from this entire episode of history. He describes the joy he expected to feel finding his colony safe, the crushing disappointment of the empty, dismantled fort, and his continued belief, a belief he clung to in writing, even after every ship and every circumstance had conspired to keep him from confirming it, that his family and the rest of the colonists were alive and well among their friends the Croatoans, exactly as the uncrossed word carved into that post seemed to promise. He wrote of committing them into the hands of God, since he could no longer commit them into his own. He never went back, whether by lack of money, lack of available ships, advancing age, or simply the accumulated exhaustion of a decade spent crossing an ocean for a colony that always seemed to slip just out of reach. White spent his final years not searching the American coast, but living quietly on Raleigh's estate in Ireland, at a place called Newtown in County Cork, where he appears to have died sometime around 1593, only a few years after that last storm-interrupted search. He left behind no further letters, no further attempts, no resolution. Only that one written record of a father's grief and a granddaughter whose fate he went to his own grave, never confirming. There is a strange, almost mirrored symmetry between White's ending and the ending eventually met by the man who had made his entire American venture possible in the first place. Walter Raleigh, whose royal patent had launched every one of these voyages, would go on to fall dramatically from favor after Elizabeth's death, imprisoned in the Tower of London for well over a decade on charges of treason under her successor, King James, allowed out briefly to lead one final, disastrous expedition to South America in search of gold, and ultimately executed in 1618. Neither of the two men most responsible for Roanoke's founding, the visionary who funded it from London and the artist who governed it in person, ever received a clear, satisfying resolution to the ventures that defined so much of their later lives. It is one more thread running through this story, an era of enormous, restless English ambition reaching across an ocean toward glory and permanence that kept producing, again and again, unfinished endings instead. Raleigh, for his part, did not entirely abandon the colony either, at least not right away. Over the following decade, he continued to hold, at least on paper, the rights and responsibility Queen Elizabeth had granted him back in 1584, and he sponsored at least one further expedition specifically intended to search for the missing colonists. In 1602, a captain named Samuel Mace sailed for the Carolina coast under Raleigh's sponsorship, with instructions that included searching for any trace of the vanished settlers. Mace's voyage, like so many before it, was diverted and delayed by other priorities along the way, and by the time his ship actually reached the region, poor weather and practical limitations kept the search frustratingly incomplete. He returned to England having gathered some local goods and information, no colonists, no clear answers, and no meaningful new evidence about what had become of the 115 people White had left behind 12 years earlier. By the time England finally established a lasting, successful colony in the region, Jamestown, founded in 1607, less than 20 miles from where some of the Roanoke search parties had once passed. The fate of the earlier colony had already begun to shift, in the English imagination, from an open, urgent question into something closer to folklore. The new Jamestown colonists heard rumors, second-hand and third-hand, of pale-skinned people living among certain native communities further south, of children with lighter hair or eyes than their neighbors, of vague, unconfirmed stories passed along through trade contacts and translators whose reliability no one could fully verify. Captain John Smith himself recorded some of these rumors, and later colonial leaders occasionally sent small parties to investigate reports of survivors, always without definitive result. None of these later efforts ever produced a documented encounter with a single confirmed survivor of the original Roanoke colony, or their descendants, that historians today consider fully reliable. One report deserves particular attention because it offers a darker possible thread alongside the gentler Croatoan explanation, and honest history has to make room for it. William Strachey, an official with the Jamestown colony who compiled a detailed account of Virginia in the early 1600s, recorded that Chief Powhatan, the powerful paramount leader whose territory bordered the new Jamestown settlement, and whose daughter Pocahontas would become one of the era's other famous complicated figures, had told the English of a group of pale-skinned people who had once lived among a community to the south at places Strachey recorded as Pecaracanek and Ohanoak, reportedly dwelling in stone-walled houses of a style no native community in the region built for themselves, a detail some historians have read as a garbled description of English-style construction. According to this account relayed second-hand through Powhatan, and never independently confirmed by any English eyewitness, these survivors had been killed sometime shortly before the Jamestown colonists' own arrival on Powhatan's own orders, out of fear that a prophecy foretelling his people's destruction by pale strangers might come to pass through them. It is important to be honest about how much weight this account can actually bear. It comes to us third-hand at best. Powhatan's words, translated through interpreters, recorded by Strachey years after the fact, describing an event Strachey himself never witnessed. It has never been corroborated by any archaeological find, and it sits in direct tension with the physical evidence now accumulating on Hatteras Island, which points toward integration and survival rather than slaughter. Some historians take it seriously as evidence that at least some portion of the Roanoke colonists may have split from the main group and settled elsewhere on the mainland, meeting a harder fate than those who reached Croatoan. Others treat it as exactly the kind of second-hand motivated rumor that tends to accumulate around any unresolved mystery, especially one being relayed by a chief who had his own political reasons for wanting the new Jamestown settlers to fear crossing him. The honest answer is that we simply don't know how much truth, if any, this account contains. And it stands today as the primary reason serious historians still describe Croatoan as the leading theory, rather than the only one. And so gradually, across the early decades of the 1600s, the story stopped being a live search and became something else entirely. A mystery, retold, elaborated, and eventually mythologized, filling in the enormous gap where solid evidence simply didn't exist, with whatever explanation each new generation of storytellers found most compelling. By the 1800s, as American writers and historians began constructing a national origin story out of the colonial past, the vanished colony had earned the name history would remember it by, the Lost Colony, a phrase that captures something true about the mystery's emotional weight, even as it somewhat overstates how genuinely mysterious the most likely answer actually was, even at the time.
Because here is something worth sitting with, before this story moves any further into legend and speculation. The one piece of hard evidence the colonists left behind, carved calmly into a post with no distress mark above it, pointed to a specific, known, friendly destination the entire time. Monteo's people, Croatoan, a short sail south, along the same barrier islands, to a community the English had known, traded with, and trusted for 6 years by the time that word was carved. It was not a cryptic riddle. It was, in its own quiet way, an answer, one that a violent storm, a fleet commander's other priorities, and simple bad luck kept anyone from actually confirming. For 400 years and counting. What kept that simple, plausible answer from settling the matter, generation after generation, was not a lack of evidence pointing toward it. It was the much stranger, much more human tendency of a mystery, once it takes hold of the public imagination, to resist even the most reasonable explanation, especially once other, far less reasonable explanations begin to circulate instead, dressed up as certainty and carved quite literally into stone. The stones that lied. Before we go any further into the more recent, more scientific chapters of this story, it's worth spending some time with one of its strangest detours. A chapter that has nothing to do with archaeology or genuine evidence, and everything to do with how badly people want a mystery like this one to have a tidy ending, even when that ending has to be manufactured by hand. In 1937, more than 3 centuries after John White carved his last hopeful entry about a word on a post, a traveler named Louis Hammond arrived at Emory University in Atlanta, carrying a heavy, roughly 21-pound chunk of quartz. He claimed to have found it in a swamp near Edenton, North Carolina, not far from the old Roanoke settlement, while passing through on a trip. Carved into its surface was an inscription, weathered but legible,
that appeared to describe the fate of the Roanoke colonists, written, it claimed, in the voice of Eleanor Dare herself, John White's own daughter, describing deaths among the colony and a desperate final message meant for whoever might one day find it. The stone caught the attention of a history professor at the university, and from there it found its way to a man named Dr. Haywood Pierce, Jr., a professor and vice president at Brownell College in Georgia, who became deeply invested in authenticating what came to be known as the Chowan River Stone. Pierce arranged for tests, consulted linguists and historians, and publicized the discovery as potentially one of the most significant artifacts in early American history. Physical, written proof in Eleanor Dare's own hand of what had happened to the lost colony at last. Then things took a stranger turn. Over the following 2 years, a man named Bill Eberhart, a resident of Georgia with a habit of turning up unusual archaeological finds, began bringing Pierce additional inscribed stones, dozens of them eventually, nearly 3 dozen in total, each one supposedly carved by Eleanor Dare or other colonists as they moved further and further inland, describing years of wandering, hardship, and eventually death far from the coast. Pierce purchased stone after stone from Eberhart, and for a time an entire narrative took shape. Not just a lost colony that vanished at Roanoke, but colonists who had survived for years afterward, trekking deep into the interior, leaving behind a trail of carved testimony as they went. It did not hold up. As more stones appeared, inconsistencies multiplied in the carving style, in the supposed geological weathering, in details that simply didn't square with what historians already knew. When Pierce began pressing Eberhart with pointed questions about where exactly all these additional stones kept coming from, Eberhart responded not with an explanation, but with an attempted extortion. He produced one final stone, carved with a message that, stripped of any pretense at colonial authenticity, read, "Pierce and Dare Historical Hoaxes. We dare anything." Eberhart reportedly demanded payment to keep that stone and its blunt confession out of the hands of a national magazine. Pierce, to his considerable credit, refused to pay, and instead went to the newspapers himself, admitting publicly that he had very likely been deceived. The story broke widely in May of 1941, and Pierce's academic reputation never fully recovered from it. Modern testing methods, unavailable to Pierce and his contemporaries in the 1930s and 40s, have only strengthened the case against the bulk of the collection. Later researchers examining tool marks, weathering patterns, and the specific style of lettering used across the Eberhart stones found telltale signs of recent carving disguised with artificial aging. Techniques a patient forger with basic tools and some knowledge of period handwriting could plausibly have managed, especially working, as Eberhart apparently was, under the encouragement of a scholar who badly wanted each new stone to be genuine.
In the decades since, the vast majority of the so-called Dare stones, the dozens purchased from Eberhard, have been essentially universally rejected by historians and archaeologists as forgeries, crafted, almost certainly, to profit from a professor's genuine hope of solving one of America's oldest mysteries. The very first stone, the original Chowan River stone brought forward by Louis Hammond before Eberhart ever entered the picture, occupies a slightly murkier position. Some later analysis has left a narrow door open to the possibility that it, unlike its many imitators, might have genuinely old origins, though there is no scientific consensus confirming it as authentic either. What can be said clearly, without hedging, is this. The Dare stones as a whole are not evidence of anything that happened to the Roanoke colonists. They are evidence of how much people wanted an answer, and how easily that wanting can be exploited by someone willing to carve a lie into rock and wait for a hopeful scholar to find it. The Dare stones were, in one sense, nothing new, a fairly typical entry in a much longer American tradition of manufactured archaeological sensations, feeding a public appetite for tidy, dramatic answers to genuinely open historical questions. Only a few decades earlier, an entirely different hoax, the so-called Cardiff Giant, had briefly convinced large portions of the American public that a 10-foot stone figure unearthed on a New York farm was either a petrified ancient man or a biblical relic before it was exposed as a manufactured stunt. The pattern repeats across the centuries with remarkable consistency. A genuine, unresolved historical mystery, a public primed to want an ending, and someone, somewhere, willing to manufacture that ending for money, attention, or simply the thrill of fooling people who badly wanted to be fooled. Roanoke's mystery, precisely because it had already sat unresolved for 3.5 centuries by the time Lewis Hammond walked into Emory University with his quartz stone, was exactly the kind of long-simmering question this sort of hoax tends to target. There is a second thread of legend worth mentioning here too, one that is gentler, older, and rooted in something more complicated than a con man's greed. As early as the beginning of the 1700s, an English explorer and writer named John Lawson, traveling through the Carolina coastal region and recording what he observed of the native communities there, wrote of encountering people on Hatteras Island who described having ancestors who could, as Lawson recorded it, talk from a book, a phrase generally understood to mean they could read, and who were said to have gray eyes, a trait uncommon among the wider Algonquian-speaking population, but consistent with some degree of English ancestry generations back. Lawson connected these accounts in his own writing to the vanished Roanoke colonists more than a century after White's final search. That thread continued in various forms for generations afterward, surfacing again in the oral traditions of the Lumbee people of Robeson County, North Carolina, a large, present-day Native American community with its own long, complicated, and still debated history of formation from multiple ancestral groups over several centuries. Some Lumbee families and historians have, at different points, connected part of their community's origin to Roanoke's vanished colonists, citing surname overlaps with names recorded among the original colony's roster. Alongside these older oral traditions of lighter eyes and English-adjacent customs passed down through generations. This is a very different kind of claim than the Dare stones, and it deserves to be treated with a different kind of care. It is not a forgery manufactured for profit. It is a living community's own account of its own ancestry, carried forward across centuries, largely through spoken memory rather than written record, and oral tradition of that kind, across countless cultures and countless historical questions, has often turned out to preserve real, verifiable information that written records missed entirely, even when it cannot be checked against a formal document. At the same time, honest history has to say plainly that no genetic study, no documentary record, and no archaeological find has yet definitively confirmed a direct line between the Lumbee community and the specific 115 people who vanished from Roanoke in the 1590s. The connection remains a genuine, respected tradition, neither proven fact nor a debunked hoax like the stones that shared headlines with it for so long, but something that belongs, honestly, in a category of its own, possible, plausible, unresolved, and deserving of more careful, respectful study than it has often received. What both of these threads share, the cynical hoax and the sincere tradition alike, is the same underlying truth about this story. 400 years without a confirmed answer is an almost unbearably long time for a mystery to sit open, and in that much silence, people will always fill the gap with something, sometimes with careful scholarship, sometimes with wishful thinking, and sometimes, as Eberhard proved, with a chisel and a slab of quartz, with an outright lie, built specifically to be believed. Telling this story honestly means holding all of that at once, taking the real evidence seriously, taking respectful oral tradition seriously on its own terms, and firmly, clearly setting aside the parts of the legend that were never anything more than a con. It would take modern archaeology, working patiently and slowly across the very ground the colonists once walked, to finally offer something the stones never could, evidence that didn't need to be believed on faith, because it could be measured, dated, and held in a gloved hand instead. What the ground remembered. While the Dare stones were being exposed as a hoax and the Lumbee oral tradition continued quietly, generation after generation, largely outside the attention of mainstream historians, one crucial piece of the puzzle was sitting patiently in the wood itself, waiting for a kind of science that hadn't been invented yet. In the 1990s, a team of climate scientists studying old-growth bald cypress trees along the Virginia and Carolina coast, some of them centuries old, their trunks holding a year-by-year record of growth rings stretching back long before English ships ever appeared on this coastline. Published findings that reframed the entire Roanoke story, in a way no historian working purely from written documents ever could. By measuring the width of each ring, which narrows during dry years and widens during wet ones, researchers were able to reconstruct rainfall patterns across this region, reaching back roughly 800 years. What they found, when they lined that record up against the calendar, was almost eerie in its precision. The years 1587 through 1589, precisely the years John White's colony was struggling to establish itself, and precisely the years immediately following his final, storm-interrupted search, corresponded to the single driest 3-year stretch in that entire 8-century record. This wasn't a minor dry spell. It was an extreme, extraordinary drought, the kind of climate event a farming community, whether English or Algonquian, would have felt as an existential threat rather than an inconvenience. For the Roanoke colonists, arriving with limited supplies and depending heavily on trade for corn from towns that were themselves struggling to grow enough food for their own people, this drought helps explain an enormous amount that the written record, taken alone, leaves murky and cruel seeming. It helps explain why food had become such a desperately contested resource even before Lane's first colony fell apart. It helps explain why towns that had once welcomed English visitors with genuine warmth grew wary and withholding as the years went on, not necessarily, or not only, because of any single act of English violence, but because there simply wasn't enough food to share, in the driest years anyone then living could remember, without endangering their own community's survival. None of this excuses what happened at Aquascogoc or to Wingina, but it adds a layer of brutal, shared desperation to a story that, read only through English eyes, can look like simple hostility on one side and simple diplomacy on the other. Everyone on that coast, English and Algonquian alike, was contending with the same unforgiving sky. The drought explains why the colonists might have struggled to survive at Roanoke. It doesn't, on its own, explain where they went. That answer, or at least the strongest evidence toward one, has come from a different kind of digging entirely. Not through tree rings, but through the ground itself. On the island, the carved word pointed to all along. Since the early 2000s, and with increasing intensity over the past 2 decades, archaeologists working under the name First Colony Foundation, alongside a locally founded organization called the Croatoan Archaeological Society, have been carefully excavating sites on Hatteras Island, the historical home of the Croatoan people, the very community Manteo belonged to, and the exact place the colonists' carved message named as their destination. Leading much of this work have been the British archaeologist Mark Horton and the local historian and archaeologist Scott Dawson, whose own family roots run deep into this same stretch of coastline and who has spent much of his career pushing back against the assumption that the answer to Roanoke's fate had to lie somewhere dramatic and undiscovered, rather than somewhere the colonists themselves had already told everyone to look. This work has not happened quickly, and it hasn't happened without real controversy along the way. Excavations at the Cape Creek site have continued across many separate digging seasons since the early 2000s, each one uncovering a little more of the picture, and each round of new findings prompting fresh debate among historians and archaeologists about exactly how much can be concluded from any single artifact. Dawson, who grew up on Hatteras Island and has spent much of his adult life pushing this research forward, often at odds with more conservative voices in the wider historical community, who preferred to treat the massacre and mutiny theories as equally plausible, has described the project less as a hunt for a single dramatic smoking gun and more as the slow accumulation of an unmistakable pattern. One artifact, easy to dismiss as a stray trade item, but dozens of artifacts layered consistently across multiple seasons of careful digging, much harder to explain away as anything other than sustained, shared habitation. What they have found, layer by careful layer, at a site near Cape Creek on Hatteras Island, is a growing body of English objects dating unmistakably to the right period, buried at a depth roughly 4 to 6 feet down, consistent with occupation in the late 1500s and early 1600s. Among the finds, fragments of English rapier hilts, gun flints and pieces of firearms, a slate writing tablet, and pencil of the exact kind Thomas Harriot's own scientific work would have used, and various pieces of decorative metalwork, including a signet ring. Crucially, none of these objects were found in isolation, sitting apart, as though simply traded or dropped by a single passing visitor. They were found mixed directly together with Algonquian pottery and other everyday native artifacts, in the same layers of soil, suggesting not a brief trading encounter, but people living together, sharing the same households and the same daily material life over an extended period of time. Perhaps the single most compelling piece of evidence, though, is a small, unglamorous substance most visitors to a museum would walk straight past without a second glance. Hammer scale. It's the flaky, dark residue that flakes off hot iron during blacksmithing, a byproduct of forging and repairing metal tools and weapons, produced only where actual ironworking is taking place. The Croatoan people, by every account of their own technology at the time, did not work iron themselves. It wasn't part of their existing metallurgical tradition. English colonists, on the other hand, absolutely did, and would have needed to, in order to repair tools, weapons, and hardware far from any European supply chain. Finding hammer scale mixed into the same soil layers as this English and Algonquian material together strongly suggests that English colonists weren't simply passing through Hatteras Island briefly. They were living there, working there, repairing their own equipment there for long enough to leave this kind of industrial residue behind in the ground. Taken together, the tree-ring drought data explaining the desperate pressure the colony was under, and the growing archaeological record on Hatteras showing English and Algonquian material life mixed together at meaningful depth and quantity, a picture begins to form that looks very different from either the dramatic massacre theories or the wilder speculative fiction that has attached itself to this mystery over the centuries. It looks, instead, remarkably close to exactly what that single carved word always suggested it might be. Not a colony that vanished into catastrophe, but a colony that walked, deliberately and without panic, toward the one place on this entire coastline where they already had friends waiting. Archaeology is not the only modern discipline that has turned its attention to this question in recent years. Genetic researchers have also taken up the search, most notably through an ongoing effort sometimes referred to as the Lost Colony DNA Project, which has worked to collect and compare genetic samples from people today who carry surnames matching those recorded on the original 1587 colonist roster, alongside members of native communities along this same stretch of coastline, including the Lumbee and other groups with long-standing oral traditions of partial Roanoke ancestry. This kind of research is genuinely difficult, for reasons that have nothing to do with anyone's competence. 430 years of intermarriage, migration, and simple genetic drift make it extremely hard to trace a clean, unbroken line back to a single, small founding population, even when surname and oral tradition both point in a consistent direction. As of the most recent published findings, no study has yet produced the kind of definitive, unambiguous genetic match that would settle the question outright, though researchers describe the work as ongoing, with new samples and methods being added steadily as the science of ancient and comparative DNA analysis continues to improve. It remains one more open thread in a story that has, across 4 centuries, slowly accumulated far more threads than any single discipline has managed to tie off on its own. That is not the same thing as certainty. Archaeology of this kind builds its case slowly, one layer and one artifact at a time, and reasonable historians still debate exactly how much weight this evidence can bear on its own. But it is, by a wide margin, the strongest physical evidence anyone has ever recovered bearing directly on the colonists' fate. Stronger than a hoaxed stone, stronger than a second-hand rumor passed to a Jamestown captain, stronger than 4 centuries of speculation about massacre, mutiny, or shipwreck. And it points, patiently and quietly, back to the very word John White found waiting for him on that post in 1590, and never got the chance to follow. 439 years later. It has now been 439 years since John White's colony first stepped ashore on Roanoke Island, full of hope, carrying a newborn girl who would become one of the most quietly famous infants in American history, without ever, as far as anyone can prove, living long enough to know her own name was remembered. 439 years is a long time for a question to stay open. It is long enough for the people who asked it first to become historical figures themselves. Long enough for their descendants' descendants to grow old and pass the question along, unanswered, to yet another generation. And long enough, evidently, for a hoaxed rock and a genuine oral tradition to become tangled together in the public imagination, until careful researchers had to spend real effort untangling them again. So, where does that leave us, honestly? standing here in the present with everything this story has gathered along the way. Let's hold the full shape of it together one more time before we let it rest. In 1587, roughly 115 Englishmen, women and children settled on a low, marshy island already scarred by a previous colony's violence. A burned village, a murdered chief, 15 missing soldiers whose own fate was never fully resolved. They arrived hoping to build something permanent, and within weeks, that hope was already complicated by another killing, a tragic case of mistaken identity, a hopeful baptism, and the first English birth on this entire continent, all crowded into the same handful of desperate summer weeks. Their governor left to fetch supplies he fully intended to bring back within months, and instead spent 3 years trapped behind a war with Spain that had nothing to do with them, arriving home again to find no bodies, no wreckage, no sign of violence at all. Only a single word, carved calmly into a post, with no cross above it, pointing to a specific known friendly island just to the south. For 4 centuries, that calm, specific answer competed for attention against every wilder story anyone could invent to fill the silence where certainty should have been. Colonists massacred by hostile warriors, colonists swallowed by a hurricane, colonists marched inland and absorbed or slaughtered by distant unnamed tribes, colonists whose descendants left carved stones scattered across Georgia and the Carolinas, describing years of wandering. Stones that turned out, on close inspection, to be nothing more than an elaborate scheme built to profit from exactly the kind of desperate hope this story tends to produce in anyone who spends too long inside it. And underneath all of that noise, quietly, patiently, the actual evidence kept pointing the same direction it always had. Tree rings, measured ring by ring across 800 years, confirming that the colonists arrived in the middle of the worst drought this coastline had endured in all that recorded time. A drought severe enough to explain the desperate, sometimes tragic competition for food that runs through nearly every chapter of this story, on both sides of every encounter. And more recently, over the past 2 decades, careful archaeological work on Hatteras Island, Croatoan, exactly as the post once read, turning up English weapons and tools and writing materials, mixed directly into the same soil layers as Algonquian pottery, at a depth consistent with sustained shared occupation rather than a brief visit. And running through all of it, that small, unglamorous trace of hammer scale, proof, as close as this kind of archaeology can offer, that English hands were forging and repairing iron on Croatoan soil for long enough to leave real, physical residue behind. It's worth remembering, too, that this theory doesn't have to be the entire, tidy explanation for every single person who once lived in that colony. 115 people is a large enough group that more than one thing could plausibly have happened to different portions of it at once. Some may have gone to Croatoan, as the carved word suggests, and stayed there, woven gradually into that community across the following years. Others, perhaps a smaller group that split off separately, may be the same people Powhatan spoke of to the Jamestown colonists. A story with a far darker ending, never fully confirmed, existing uneasily alongside the more hopeful archaeological picture emerging from Hatteras Island. History rarely resolves into a single clean thread, especially when it involves this many individual people making individual choices under desperate, uncertain circumstances, and the most honest version of this story may ultimately be a braided one. Most of the colony finding safety at Croatoan, while a smaller number met a harder fate we may never fully recover.
This is the theory that has, over the last several years, gathered the most genuine, careful, peer-reviewed weight behind it. That the Roanoke colonists were never lost in the dramatic, sudden sense the phrase "Lost Colony" implies. They were never swallowed whole by mystery in a single terrible night. Instead, worn down by drought, by isolation, by 3 years of waiting for a governor and a resupply that war kept postponing again and again, they made a deliberate, sensible choice. The same choice any reasonable person in their position might make. They walked or sailed the short distance toward the one community on this entire stretch of coastline that had already proven itself a genuine friend across 6 difficult years. Manteo's own people on Croatoan. And there, it now increasingly appears, many of them stayed, not as prisoners, not as refugees clinging to the margins, but gradually, generation by generation, as neighbors, then relatives, then simply as people. Their English surnames and gray eyes and scattered fragments of language folded slowly into a native community that had chosen, for reasons of its own kinship and generosity, to take them in. It's worth saying clearly, one more time, exactly how confident we can honestly be in that picture. This is not a solved case in the way a courtroom uses that phrase. No single document has surfaced confirming it beyond doubt. No definitive genetic study has traced an unbroken line from a named Roanoke colonist to a specific living descendant today. What we have is something a little humbler than absolute proof, and, in its own way, more honest. A convergent, growing body of evidence, climate science, archaeology, oral tradition, and the colonists' own calm, deliberate message, all independently pointing toward the same quiet, undramatic answer. Careful historians describe this as the leading theory, the best supported explanation available, rather than a settled fact. And that distinction matters. Plenty of the videos and articles that found their way across the internet in the past couple of years have been quick to declare the mystery solved outright, in headlines built for clicks rather than nuance. The truer, more careful version is gentler than that, and, if anything, more moving for being so. After 439 years of massacre theories, hurricane theories, hoaxed stones, and half-remembered rumors, the most likely answer all along may simply be the one the colonists themselves left us, in their own hand, on the very day they walked away. Somewhere, in the blood and the stories and the surnames of families living today along the North Carolina coast, in the deep, careful oral traditions the Lumbee community has carried forward for generations, and in the quiet, ongoing work of archaeologists still sifting through the sandy soil of Hatteras Island, one careful layer at a time, some thread of that vanished colony may still, in some real sense, exist. Not lost in the end, so much as simply, deliberately, gently, absorbed into a wider, older story that was already being written on this coastline, long before an English ship ever appeared on its horizon. Think for a moment about everyone this story actually touched, on both sides of every encounter it contains. Granganemio, extending an open hand to strangers on a beach who would, within 2 years, burn a neighboring town to the ground. Wingina, watching a fragile welcome curdle into an occupation he had never agreed to host, choosing resistance and paying for that choice with his life. Manteo, spending decades of his life as the one bridge between two worlds that trusted each other less with every passing season. Honored by one side, and, in some real sense, permanently separated from full belonging in either. Eleanor Dare, giving birth in a half-abandoned fort surrounded by grief, naming her daughter for a queen and a colony that would both, in their own ways, fail to protect either of them. And John White himself, an artist who only ever wanted to paint and record this new world faithfully, forced instead into the role of a governor, then an absent grandfather, then an old man who spent his final years unable to stop wondering whether the family he loved had found safety or had not. John White never got to know that. He sailed home in 1590 carrying nothing but a carved word and an unbearable, unresolved hope. And he died a few years later, an ocean away from his daughter and his granddaughter, never learning whether the answer he'd been handed was really as gentle as it looks to us now, standing this far downstream from all of it, with tools and evidence he never could have imagined.
Maybe that's a kind of comfort worth carrying with you, here at the end of this long, quiet crossing. Not every mystery resolves in fire or blood or tragedy. Sometimes, after all the theories and all the noise, the truth turns out to be something softer. 115 tired, frightened people, walking a short distance toward people who had already shown them kindness once, choosing, quietly and without ceremony, to simply begin again.
If you're still here, still listening, thank you for staying this far into the night with me. The story is finished now. There's nothing left to carry forward except your own rest. Wherever you are, however heavy your day was, you can let it go now, the same way that small colony, all those centuries ago, finally let go of a place that had only ever brought them hardship, and walked quietly towards somewhere kinder. If you enjoyed this crossing, consider staying aboard for the next one. The ferry will be here again tomorrow night, waiting at the dock, ready to carry you somewhere else. Good night.